The civil rights movement was a unique moment in time. I was saying that I wish I'd known then what I know now, that what I was living through in the 60s when I was working on the movement was this unique moment in time when there was a sense that we really could touch the problems of fundamental inequality that deal with race and gender, that deal with sexual orientation, that deal with poverty. And we believed that we could do something about it, something real, something meaningful. And a great deal of progress was made. I don't want to suggest that the progress wasn't made, but we hit a stone wall. We hit a wall at some point in which there was a counter-reaction both from the very comfortable in the country who didn't want to see equality continue, and a counter-reaction from people who were frightened about others with different color skin, about others with different origins than theirs. And that counteraction set off a long period of political darkness. I don't think we can say it any other way. We've gone through a very, very long period where it's been almost unthinkable to make progress. We've been trying to hold on to what we were able to establish in the 60s and early 70s at this point. And I actually think if Mr. Rustin were here, I used to call him Mr. Rustin. I absolutely could never call him by his first name. But if Mr. Rustin were here, he said in 1965 that it's time to get out of the streets and get into politics. I think if he were here now, he would say it's time to reinforce politics by going back into the streets.
World. And so I think that Rustin understood his inner world had changed, so he was going to manufacture that in the outer world. And I think if individuals were to evolve beyond simply self and understand the interconnectedness of our humanity, then we would see a better society. And ideally, that's what America is supposed to be, at least on paper. But, and we're working towards it. Clearly, you might find similar principles in which you have this inward experience that helps you see the outward world. And I think we're being forced to see that more because the pain, even though most of us might be employed or moneyed or living indoors, can see more people living outdoors, seeing people losing houses. And at some point, you have to not have a pulse to not be pained by seeing that. And on some level, I think irrespective of how we choose to view ourselves in the microcosm, the pain of human suffering is so great that it's going to force us to have a conversation about how do we, as human beings, allow other human beings to experience such deprivation when there is such great opportunity on this side with wealth and not enough for someone on the other side. I forget.
Well, in many ways, the United States is unique in the fact that much of the way political conversation, political discourse in this country is framed, to use George Lakoff's phrase, is in the language of rights, and more generally, in the language of law, right? So our politics is a very legalistic politics when people articulate their needs, right, and their demands primarily in the language of rights. So for me, it's worth asking, how does rights language empower people politically? How does rights language empower people gathered collectively in social movements? Right? And how does rights language operate as a barrier or an impediment to empowerment of people and social movements?
And that rhetoric has power. Mm-hmm. And what's happened is the right has taken that rhetoric and turned it and said, hey, you're right. The government's under your bed and it's going to take your First Amendment rights, but it's also going to take your property. And it's also going to take everything else. So we have to get rid of government. When you get rid of government and push it out, as we've been talking about nothing else since 1980, our politics have been essentially dominated by the question of, can we mug government, get it into a bathtub, and drown it? And that's basically what the right has tried to do. When you get rid of government, you create a vacuum. Power
purposely want people to die on the streets, but I think when people don't see it as part of their cloistered community, then it's not my problem. And as a result, since that person doesn't look like me or think like me or relate to me, whoever me is, thank you 1980s once again, the me idea, then why should I care?
Accepted it. I mean, the academy has accepted it, the bar has accepted it, philosophers have accepted it, even historians have made they've drawn a radical distinction between the right to housing and the right not to be censored. And somehow the right not to be censored is the road we go down, and the right to housing, that's not a real right. So it seems to me we've got to fight about, we really have to not accept this distinction between negative and positive rights. The second trap, I fell into it because I was a young lawyer and was just totally besotted with, the ability to go into court and win cases and do all sorts of things. And I forgot, as many of us forgot, that the rights we were winning were means, not ends. That's right. That winning the right was the means to do what you're talking about as creating freedom. You win the right not to be censored, not because that's valuable in and of itself, but because it leads to a culture and a society in which the voices of the impoverished can't be silenced. And then you get a chance to build the world that you hope that you build. And I can't tell you.
Okay. Well, Mr. Rustin was saying in the feminist movement and civil rights, he said it was not going to go very far because the feminists asked for narrow things. So in regards to your negative rights, they asked for abortion rights and some other 3 things they had asked for. And he said that was very good, but they didn't take into the larger situation of health care for the poor because they were already affluent, they already had husbands, they had children in daycare, so they didn't see the poverty side of it. So you only can see reality according to your mandates. I mean, unless you've lived another life or are gifted to care about someone else, you only can see reality according to how you process. Mm-hmm. And I think what Rustin was saying, the activists need to see beyond their actual reality and engage those other communities some way, which is what you're saying, right, to live this kind of private life in a public way in which you might see something that would help you reframe how you're seeing your reality.
Yeah. So get me. When Mr. Rustin criticized the feminist movement, one of the hopeful signs is that they listened. And the modern feminist movement is worried about economic rights, is worried about poor people around the world in a way that I wish we could replicate in many other settings. And finally, I'll say,
beyond the borders of the United States, as Professor Neuborne has encouraged us to other ways of talking about community. One of the most powerful of which I think we've seen in the last 25 or so years has been the notion made famous globally by Archbishop Desmond Tutu of Ubuntu, which was actually taken up by the Constitutional Court of South Africa in its decision interpreting their interim constitution. This idea that people are people through other people, right? And that the regnant notion in this country that to be a human being is first and foremost to be an individual, and that personhood is about individualism, is a false conception of what human existence is all about, namely.
That's why what both of you said about the importance of unlocking imagination is so important. It's because imagination changed that we're able today to talk seriously about equal rights for people who are who have different sexuality than we do. And it was only imagination that made that possible. The imagination didn't exist when Bayard Rustin was alive. And that is just a tragic, he was too early for his time.
And he wasn't alone. That, it seems to me, is one of the great tragedies of contemporary African-American politics, that it has moved from the high moral vision that King and Rustin embody about the indivisibility of injustice and the fight against injustice, to the moralizing politics that seems to require the demeaning, the denigration, the demonization, in fact, of gay men and lesbians because they somehow pose a threat to the legacy of the civil rights movement.
Almost all the questions. By the way, you give New York City much too much credit. It is not the capital of the free world. It's just another place that's got the haves and the have-nots, and the haves usually manage to keep the have-nots away, and that's what's happening to you. I wish it were the capital of the free world.